The history of the United States is often celebrated for its ideals of liberty and democracy. Yet, beneath this proud narrative lie unsettling truths, events marked by systemic oppression, violence, and injustice. Acknowledging these dark chapters is crucial for understanding the nation's complex legacy and addressing enduring inequalities. This video explores 9 such episodes, revealing a pattern of marginalization and exploitation that challenges the myth of American exceptionalism. 1. Native American genocide. The colonization of North America led to centuries of violence against indigenous peoples. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced around 100,000 Native Americans from their ancestral lands. The Cherokee Trail of Tears, 1838 and 39, caused 15,000 deaths during a 200-mile march to Oklahoma. In 1890, the Wounded Knee Massacre marked the brutal suppression of Native resistance, killing 300 Lakota men, women, and children. By 1900, the indigenous population had dropped to 250,000 from an estimated 515 million before colonization. These events were not isolated tragedies but part of a deliberate effort to erase indigenous cultures and seize their land. The lasting effects of these policies continue to impact Native communities today, highlighting the deep scars left by forced removals, violence, and cultural suppression. 2. Slavery and the legacy of racial terror. Between 1619 and 1865, over 12 million Africans were trafficked to the Americas, with 2 million dying en route. Enslaved people endured brutal conditions, family separation, and dehumanization. Even after emancipation, Black Americans faced Jim Crow laws, lynching, and sharecropping, a system akin to economic slavery. The 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, where white mobs destroyed the prosperous Greenwood district, killing 300 and displacing 10,000, underscored the violent enforcement of racial hierarchy. Such systemic racism laid the groundwork for today's racial disparities in wealth, health, and incarceration. These historical traumas continue to shape communities, policies, and individual lives, underscoring the urgent need for systemic reform. Recognizing and confronting this past is essential to building a fairer future for all Americans and requires dedication. 3. Japanese American internment, 1942-1946. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, leading to the forced relocation of 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were U.S. citizens. They were sent to internment camps where they endured harsh living conditions, cramped barracks, and constant surveillance. Despite the lack of any proven espionage, the Supreme Court upheld this violation of civil rights in Korematsu v. U.S., 1944. Families lost their homes, businesses, and sense of security. Decades later, in 1988, the U.S. government formally apologized and provided reparations. But for many, the damage was irreversible. This dark chapter in American history left a lasting legacy of trauma and set a dangerous precedent for racial discrimination in times of national crisis. 4. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, 1932-1972. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study was a shocking violation of medical ethics. From 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service misled 600 Black men in Alabama, 399 with syphilis, by offering free health care but secretly studying the disease's effects without treatment. Even after penicillin became the standard cure in the 1940s, researchers withheld it. By the study's end, 128 men had died from syphilis-related causes. Exposed in 1972, the experiment highlighted deep medical racism, fueling lasting distrust in healthcare among Black communities. The scandal led to ethical reforms in medical research, including stricter guidelines for informed consent and patient protections. Though reforms were made, the study's legacy remains a painful reminder of systemic racism in American history. 5. The Philippine-American War, 1899-1902. After taking control of the Philippines from Spain in 1898, the United States fought a brutal war to crush Filipino independence. The conflict led to the deaths of over 200,000 civilians, many from famine, disease, and violence. U.S. forces used brutal tactics, including torture, concentration camps, and the destruction of entire villages. Some American soldiers massacred civilians, including women and children. The war, often downplayed in history books, exposed the imperialist motives behind America's so-called civilizing mission. While the U.S. justified its actions as bringing progress and order, the reality was widespread suffering and resistance. The war officially ended in 1902, but unrest and resistance against American rule continued for years. 6. Eugenics and forced sterilization. In the early 20th century, 32 U.S. states passed eugenics laws, leading to the forced sterilization of over 60,000 individuals labeled unfit, including minorities, the disabled, and the poor. The Supreme Court upheld these policies in Buck v. Bell, 1927, with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously stating, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." California, a leader in eugenics, sterilized 20,000 people by 1960. These laws, based on flawed science, disproportionately targeted marginalized communities and later influenced Nazi Germany's racial hygiene programs. Though eugenics declined after World War II, its impact lingers, as many victims never received justice or compensation for these violations of human rights. 7. COINTELPRO, 1956-1971. The FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, operated covertly to disrupt civil rights and leftist groups from the 1950s to the 1970s. Using tactics like wiretapping, disinformation, and infiltration, the program aimed to weaken movements challenging government authority. Key targets included Martin Luther King Jr., the Black Panthers, and the American Indian Movement. The FBI sought to discredit leaders, create internal conflicts, and incite violence to justify crackdowns. COINTELPRO's exposure revealed the government's efforts to suppress democratic activism, often violating constitutional rights. Its legacy remains a cautionary tale of how state power can be used to silence dissent and maintain social control under the guise of national security. 8. The My Lai Massacre, 1968. During the Vietnam War, U.S. soldiers massacred over 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians in My Lai village, including women, children, and the elderly. The military initially covered it up, but whistleblowers exposed the atrocity in 1969, sparking global outrage. Despite the crime's severity, only Lieutenant William Calley was convicted, receiving a lenient sentence of 3 years under house arrest. The My Lai massacre became a symbol of wartime brutality, the dehumanization of conflict, and the moral failures of U.S. foreign policy. It intensified anti-war sentiment in the U.S., leading to widespread protests and greater scrutiny of military actions. The massacre also raised urgent questions about accountability, ethics, and the consequences of unchecked power in war. Its legacy remains a dark chapter in U.S. history, reminding the world of the horrors of war and the need for justice. 9. Forced sterilization of indigenous women, 1970s. In the 1970s, the Indian Health Service, IHS, forcibly sterilized thousands of Native American women without informed consent, often during childbirth. An estimated 25–50% of indigenous women of childbearing age were subjected to the procedure, significantly reducing tribal populations. Many women were misled or coerced, unaware they were being sterilized. This act of medical genocide was part of a broader effort to erode Native sovereignty and control indigenous futures. The devastating consequences extended beyond population decline, leaving lasting intergenerational trauma and deep distrust in government and healthcare institutions. Activists later exposed the abuses, leading to policy changes, but the damage had already been done. The sterilization campaign remains a dark chapter in U.S. history, highlighting the systemic oppression Native communities have endured. In conclusion, confronting these dark truths is not about condemning the nation, but about striving for justice and progress. The lingering effects of slavery, systemic racism, and indigenous struggles reveal the deep roots of inequality. Movements like Black Lives Matter and advocacy for indigenous rights serve as reminders that reckoning with history is essential. Acknowledging these realities allows the U.S. to build a future based on fairness, accountability, and meaningful change. Only by facing uncomfortable truths can society prevent past atrocities from repeating. History teaches that true progress demands honesty, no matter how painful the journey may be. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe. Your support matters. Thank you.